right, well, can't believe we're all here together, and all of us are here together, all together now, I guess you could say. Sorry, had to do it. Welcome to not only Talk More Talks live from the Fest for Beatles Fans, New York, but for the first time, all five of us are here together, and thank you. All the founders, the originators, everybody here. Also excited that Joe Mayo, this is his first ever panel at the Fest.
It just goes to show it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Exactly. So, we are going to be talking today about the year 1973, which is considered one of the best years in the solo era. And why is it? And if we have time, is it the only of the best of the solo years? We're going to throw that out to you. Before we get to our discussion, briefly just want to introduce all of us here. As I just mentioned, making his Fest debut, you know him from his highly popular channel, Me, Mr. Mayo, Joe Mayo. You know him as just kind of a legend, really, in the Beatles community, who hosts so many shows, including the one, if you were just in here, co-host of the highly popular podcast, Things We Said Today, Mr. Ken Michaels. And one of our founders of Talk More Talk, who has written so many books that we would be here all hour if I went through all of them, but he is coming out with a book we are all anticipating, the Mal Evans biography, Dr. Ken Womack. He is the co-host of the also popular podcast, Two Legs, a Paul McCartney-centric podcast, Mr. Tom Hunyady. And of course, I'm the author of Songs We Are Singing, Guided Tours to the Beatles' Lesser Known Tracks, and I'm also the co-host of a new podcast called Toppermost the Poppermost, and for some reason, a lot of people like to call me the Queen, and I'll take it. I'm Kid O'Toole. All right, so let's get to our topic for today, which is, as I mentioned, the year 1973, and boy, was it a big year, right? All four had releases that year. We had from Paul McCartney the release, of course, of the My Love single, Red Rose Speedway, and at the end of the year, and Live and Let Die. At the end of the year, of course, Band on the Run. From John, we had Mind Games, and also, of course, very important to note, John and Yoko declared Utopia. You know, we can't leave that out, but just kidding. And for George, we had Living in the Material World, and then, of course, I forgot to mention one of my favorites, the Hill and Wheels single. I love that song. And Ringo, of course, came out with his magnificent Ringo album. Just a few of the releases of that year. So let's talk a little bit about where all four of them were at this point as they were recording these albums. So let's start with Paul. Tom, since you are, of course, the resident Paul expert,
That works.
you know, where was Paul in 1973 as he was working, you know, particularly on Red Rose Speedway, you know, where was he personally, professionally, and this year?
Yeah, I think, you know, as we learned
as we learned from the wonderful McCartney Legacy book, he wanted to create this band and make it a band and not just the Paul McCartney and my band show. So, I think at that point in time, it was important for him to make the public see that it's just not him, that he can carry on his own, but also work well with others, which we learned that maybe he didn't do so much with his other band, but the fact is I think he was starting to get in a good place. I think he was starting to find some confidence. I think that the Alan Klein thing, the dust on that was starting to settle. He was actually talking about maybe working with the others in '73, and I think he's finding himself in a good spot. I mean, obviously the double album didn't happen like he was hoping to, but the album was a success, and the success would live and let die. I think, and then that all that confidence rolling into Band on the Run, I think this is where he started to come into his own.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, Ken, you wrote a terrific book with Jason Krupa called "All Things Must Pass Away," about the making of All Things Must Pass, and Eric Clapton's Layla. What about George at this point? He, of course, was finished. All Things Must Pass was done, and so now he's working on Living in the Material World. And where do you think he was at this point in '73?
Well, at this point, he's already released Living in the Material World, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I'm checking with my Ken Michaels.
Yeah.
My Ken
Yeah,
Michaels,
yes.
also yours. So, George is in an interesting spot, and here we are inches away from where Patty Boyd will be in a few minutes, and I spoke with her recently at length about 1973 and, of course, the problematic nature of that year for them and their marriage. And, George is on the downside of a wonderful opening period in his solo career with All Things Must Pass and Living in the Material World. 2 #1 singles. He's been on top of the world, and he's now returning to substance abuse after years of being generally clean. He, of course, is on a trajectory for 1974 where he will tour again for the Dark Horse Tour. Speaking of Jason, he and I are working on a book called Beatles '74 about the last year in the partnership. And one of those subjects that will receive a lot of attention will be that 1974 tour. Anybody go to that? Yeah, and of course we've spoken to hundreds of people, soon to talk to these two if we know what we're doing. And it's amazing how many people for this Believer tour just loved it. Wow. Are you one of them?
Well, I was a bit disappointed only because I didn't really hear George's vocals. Maybe it was the mix. I went to the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island. I could hear the band really well. The band was great. Billy Preston was the highlight for me at the show. Such a showman. But I didn't really hear George's vocals enough to say, wow, he's really hoarse. But I love the performance. I just wish I had heard George more.
And obviously a milestone simply to even be there, as you know. So George is he's in a muddled place, at this time. There's no two ways about it. He, at this point, as maybe most people know, the only 2 people really championing the idea, the dream of Apple, are George Harrison and Mal Evans. Certainly McCartney's doing his own thing, as Tom said, and he's, of course, preparing to unleash a juggernaut. And clearly John is trying to come back from Montague, but it's Mal and George who are really still bringing in new acts, still recording them, still trying to find acts and keep that wonderful the Apple dream alive. So he's hard at work on that. His studio's up and running, the one at Briar Park. So that's where he is.
Yep, so very, very busy time for George. Personally,
Isn't that kind of the amazing part of all of this?
Yeah.
These guys don't take breaks. It's that workaholism. Workaholism.
Close enough.
That close enough. I mean, we're following English majors.
We really are.
That's what we do. So, but they're workaholics, right? I mean, does George have to be working with Splinter and hell no. But he is, I would say.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Exactly. Now, Joe, you are a John guy. I mean, not just a John guy, but you're, but you're John Van, and so this is the era of mind games, of course, as you know. So where do you think, where is John in 73 at this point?
Well, I always think, you had John first coming out swinging pretty good, having the classic emotional John Lennon Plastic Ono Band LP, which is really fantastic, and I think it's probably his greatest singing that he ever did on there. I think he had such personal topics and pain and stuff like that. Then after that, he had Imagine, which is kind of the same kind of thing, only a more commercial. I think it worked better for him that way. People could swallow it a lot easier, maybe. What he used to say, it was like, "Oh, it's just Mother with the Mother album with chocolate on it," right? But he was doing he was doing really well, music-wise. And then, of course, sometime in New York City, right, in 1972, which I think is underrated, but a little bit. But don't go by me. I'm a fan. Let's hear it from anybody. No. It's quiet.
Yes.
I was thinking it was pretty quiet. But anyway, so and then of course, he did the 1-to-1 in '72, the benefit concert for children of Willowbrook, and the concert kind of had him out there for Madison Square Garden, people to see. But I think about '73, I'm thinking he started to have some problems with Yoko. And also, musically, try to make, dare I say the word, I don't want Ken to get mad at me, comeback word, I don't know, come back, maybe with Mind Games album. And I think that Mind Games was such a fantastic single, which should have gotten higher in the charts. Really, really good. It's my favorite probably single of his. Next to Instant Karma. But I think with the Mind Games album, he's trying to, kind of come back, maybe relying on more easygoing stuff that people might be able to relate to, with a few exceptions of sloganeering, like with Leon and Lucy, Free the People, which is a good song, a little political in there, and of course, Tight As, stuff like that, Meat City. But I just think John's trying at this point to get back to having a little more of a more acceptable style. Maybe he was kind of really shaken up a little bit of the lackluster reception that sometime in New York City got, right? So I think that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get back, and it's chart-wise anyway, and music-wise, trying to find a more happy medium. That's what it feels like to me when I'm listening to the Mind Games album, which I enjoy so much. But to me, it's not quite the heights of the first two albums, or even Walls and Bridges afterwards. My opinion.
Okay, all right, we'll get back to that in a minute, but before we get to that, I want to, of course, let's talk about Ringo. And Ken, you've seen our show many times, I assume you have since you're here. We're big Ringo champions on our show, and we, of course, and I'm sure you all too, love the Ringo album. It's a classic.
Ringo.
50th anniversary edition.
Yeah, that's it. Let's hope so. 50th anniversary. I'll be there in line to buy it.
Yeah, I hope so. We get mutterings.
Yeah, there you go. So Ken, where was Ringo at this point? That led him to record Ringo, because he had been away from recording for a little bit before this.
Right. Before I answer that, I just want to add one thing to what Joe said, which I think is really important about John, is that because the immigration authorities were after him at that time, and the response he got to sometime in New York City, I think he really had to tone it down with his political beliefs at the time, and that's part of why I think Mind Games was more closer to what Imagine was, more of that approach. Ringo, it's interesting, Ringo started off his career with 2 solo albums that were completely different, An Album of Standards and An Album of Country Music, which these days is lauded, a country album. And he also had a movie career going, but the most successful thing that he had done prior to the Ringo album were the 2 singles that he released in 1971 and 72, with Don't Come Easy and Back Off Boogaloo. And even though I love those first 2 albums from Ringo, Sentimental Journey and Blue Piece of Blues, you can't help but, recognize the fact that It Don't Come Easy has become a classic. It was a number 4 hit in the country. Back Off Boogaloo also went top 10. And so Ringo decided that it was time to make a pop rock album. And also he's always battling, between the music and the films. What do I do? Because he still had a huge interest in making films. So he got together his friends, the other Beatles, and other really talented people, members of the band, Nicky Hopkins, Klaus Voormann, all those people. And he also worked with Vinnie Poncia, who I think was a really good songwriter for them in the 70s. And together they wrote On My Mind, which became a top 10 hit. But the 10 songs on the Ringo album were really superb. And as much as I will always champion Ringo's years from Time Takes Time On as being, amongst the best of his solo career, you cannot deny the greatness of the Ringo album. The other Beatles knew how to write for him. And when George and Ringo wrote together, like they did on Photograph, we just voted it on our show as the best solo Beatles single of all time, other number ones, anyway. And George played a huge part in the success of the Ringo album, because he played on, I think it's 4 tracks. I'm the Greatest, he's on Sunshine Night for Me, Photograph, and You and Me, Baby. So, and also you gotta give Mal Evans a little bit of credit. Let's give a little plug here as we get ready for Ken's book. For co-writing You and Me, Baby with George Harrison. But, and John wrote I'm the Greatest, which is a fine track, good opening track, perfect for Ringo. And Paul wrote, I think, one of the best songs Ringo's ever done, 6 O'Clock. But you also have all the other material on there. So it was a very solid album. And because he was still riding on the success of the 2 other singles, which helps, you have that momentum, it helped Photograph to become the number 1 hit that it was, and then You're 16, which went to number 1 as well, and then On My Mind, a top 10 hit. So Ringo was in a really good place for the first time he made a pop rock album, and that also became, for him, for the most part, the format he was to follow. An album with 10 songs, get my best friends on there, if I can, get some of the Beatles on there, and that's what he continued to do.
I would add, and this is the reason why I can't wait for that 50th anniversary edition. Of course, we know You and Me, Babe, which is an enormous success for Mal, because it meant he got a big piece of the mechanical royalties of that album. So all of this business about Mal having no money in the 70s is simply not true. And in fact, the Beatles were still paying him at that point and would until their partnership was officially defunct. But having said all that, it wasn't the only Mal Evans song recorded for that album. There was a second track that Mal had written. It was one of the first that Ringo sang during the sessions, and I am anxious to hear that version, to say the least. Both of those songs Mal had had for a long time. George simply helped him finish You and Me, Babe. Those were actually some lyrics he started writing back, I think, in Rishikesh. Mal did, while he was meditating one day, and well, he couldn't quite keep track of his mantra, so he needed something to do, and he began writing the lyrics of that song. But I'm very anxious for this this version, and I have yet to find anyone who really has any good outtakes beyond songs that essentially sound like the finished versions on the Ringo LP.
So do you have the lyrics to that for your book?
The lyrics
for this Mal Evans song?
Oh, I do. I do, only because Mal wrote them in a journal, in a diary entry. And then he kept notes of all the sessions. So we have yellowed note paper where he wrote who played on what. I believe Klaus Voormann was on it. Ringo did lead vocals. Lon and Derek Van Eaton have confirmed that they were there. And I spoke to Bill Schnee, and he he remembers recording the song too. So I am anxious to hear it.
Let's go November, weren't we?
Yeah. Oh, that, yeah. I thought we were talking about the box set. That's what I meant.
Yeah, I think we're all very excited for your book. But yes, the 50th anniversary box set.
Bring it on. I want that thing.
Let's do this. Absolutely. So I think it's fair to say that this was, really pivotal year, personally and professionally, for all four. Now let's turn to something that Tom, you brought up just the other night when we were at the pub, and so this is going to might be a little controversial, but that's what we're about. We love talking about, we love debating stuff. So Tom, you were talking about Red Rose Speedway, and you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you felt it really wasn't like a real Wings album.
Well, the finished product.
The finished product. So I'd like you to expand more on that.
Well, obviously there's no vocals from anybody else, right? There's no Seaside Woman. There's nothing from Denny. If Paul is dominating all the lead vocals, obviously that's what EMI wanted. They didn't want a double album. They wanted a Paul record. Unfortunately, it goes from Wings to Paul McCartney and Wings. So in that sense, for me looking back at it, I get the sense that it's Paul's machine, it's Paul's puppy. Yeah, he wants it as a band, but yet he can't get away from the fact, whether it's from EMI or other factions that don't want him to have this band just yet. They want to see success. They want to see records selling. Wildlife doesn't sell, right? I mean, the Hi does fine. Mary Had a Little Lamb maybe doesn't do as well. Give Island Back to the Irish. Those three singles, they do fine, but they're not number ones. They're not top fives, right? So I mean, the success leading up to Red Rose Speedway is probably not where he wants it. Not like the number one album with McCartney, number two with Ram. So he's not seeing this success yet. However, he's not, almost in a way, not allowed to have this album as his vision, as as the sum. The sum is greater than the parts. Well, here he is. He's the part and the sum as well.
Okay, so let's unpack this, Tom. So, like you, having read Alan and Adrian's book, I was really struck by, I think, EMI being really smart and making sure that wasn't a double album. It would not have been.
But Yoko gets two albums, two double albums. How does that happen?
I don't know. I'm not responsible for it.
I think I like Yoko's better than Red Rose Speedway.
I think it was a masterstroke, making that a hit and really setting him up so well.
Yeah.
And I remind my fellow talkers of the moment in 2018 at the White Album Conference when we met with Chris Thomas, who shared his memories of making Back to the Egg, right? And at a certain point, isn't it arguable that there are all these McCartney albums and Wings is certainly more of a band than, say, Plastic Ono Band, but still a kind of a concept.
Yeah.
Especially when you pay your sidemen a flat salary, etc. In fact, we demonstrated in our Fab Four masterclass that they were only making a few bucks more than Neil and Mal. Just for the record. Now, still not bad money in the early 70s. And I'm sure they enjoyed other perks. Denny got to take those flamenco lessons. Those are very important. Oh, it's too bad he's not here. We could ask him about those. But having said all that, it still is a kind of a concept for him, isn't it? The idea of Wings is.
Well, sure, it still is a concept, but again, I don't think he's causing a big stink. I think, look, he causes that big stink to get McCartney released when he wants it released, right? EMI doesn't necessarily want him to release Give Ireland Back to the Irish, but he still wants it released, knowing it's probably going to get banned, okay? I still think that Paul McCartney, as a musician, as the next Beatle, can still maybe cause a stink and say, hey, look, I want this copy or mirror what I'm doing right now with the rest of the members of my band.
Yeah.
You know, and I think he probably could have pulled it off.
I think he could have pulled off the
Right, he could definitely, but you might have a point though, with the single album, with the double being successful, and get that momentum going,
I mean, we know
to release that juggernaut that is, you know, Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, yeah. Right.
Sure, and as Alan and Adrian pointed out, you know, you put a couple more bucks on that in 1973, and suddenly many fewer people are going to buy it.
Right.
And it did set him up well, and it is interesting how he accepts it pretty easily.
Very easily.
Yeah, he's and you mentioned the two Yoko albums. I mean, they're not expecting to make anything with those. You know, Paul McCartney is a different kind of commercial model.
Absolutely.
Even today. Right. Still interesting food for thought. And what that book, I think, does so well, right, the Alan and Adrian book, is it shows us just how single-minded Paul is. You know, I think he probably would have had a lot more heartburn about Denny and Henry jumping ship if he weren't so focused on what he was trying to do at that point in that time in his career. It's pretty impressive.
Can I just say that it's easy. I know what it's like when you listen to the double album of Rose Speedway and say, God, I wish it really came out this way. But Rose Speedway still went to #1 in the United States for 3 weeks, dethroned by George Harrison. And My Love was a #1 single.
I bet George felt bad about that.
No, I don't think so. And who knows? I mean, Live and Let Die was waiting in the wings. No pun intended. You know, maybe that would have, you know, that was supposed to be a summer hit. If you had a double album, would you have had more singles? Who knows? It still worked out for the better, but I do think that Paul all along wanted Wings to be recognized as a band. But he didn't stick up for himself in this instance. He had such a backlog of music, and he could have put a lot of that stuff out on another album as a double album if he wanted to.
Yeah, very true.
Or certainly another single.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe, what's your take?
Oh, you asked for it. I'm just, I like Red Rose Speedway anyway as a double album. I like when, and then thanks a lot, Jerry, I appreciate that. I got the copy from it. I really wish it had come out that way. I understand why it didn't. But as such, it's never been a favorite album for me personally of Paul's. I do love the single, My Love, and Big Barn Band, which is more like I think the Ram and everything. But yeah, Paul wanted to try to get a band together. I really think that. Start off as a little band, like the Beatles kind of started out, and do that over again. And of course, we know that he was really trying to find the way to go. And then late in the year, 73, arguably 74, when it got most of its success, we come to Band on the Run, and you know that's when I think he really found his footing, so to speak. You know. So yeah, that's all I can say about that one.
Okay. All right, so good question. Give up with the pub. Now here's another wrinkle.
No more pubs.
No more pubs. Now here's another wrinkle that came up in '73. That there was another interesting.
Is this from that pub again, though?
No. This is not a pub.
I think we all have a right to know that.
No. This is not a pub question. This is another wrinkle that came up. Another interesting release: the Red and Blue albums. Yeah, that you know, and that we all know. And although it's kind of a generational thing, because probably for Tom and me, those don't figure into our collection as much as my first album was
Really?
Yeah.
You and Tom are that young.
Yes. You know, it's so, you know, seldom today that I can now say I'm a little younger. So I'm you know, I try to use it when I can.
Right.
Sorry,
You did good, kid. You did good.
Yeah.
hurting the most.
Yeah. Because 20 Greatest Hits is what was my first Beatle album. I don't know about you, Tom.
I did get the the red and blue on the set.
You did? Okay. Yeah, because I didn't really.
I think Tom had those on 8-track. I
Oh.
don't maybe hear the one here.
Okay, all right. I'm the outsider. All right. But so the red and the blue. So kind of to the whole panel here. So how do you think this figured into the solo era? Do you think this, had any impact on, album sales? I mean, that here are the Beatles, the solo Beatles, really taking off even more in their solo careers, getting #1 hits, #1 albums, and then here comes their past, coming in. What do you think? What impact did this have, if any?
Well, just real quick, obviously 1973 is, the Beatles are selling a lot of units, and remember, there is, part of those dollars are share and share alike. So, it's kind of nice if Wings does well for John Lennon, to a point when the taxes become overwhelming, as he said many times in the press. But you have to think that it was so competitive, of course, in popular music then, and all the way through the early 80s when it was a war, right, to get to the top. And many great records, which we consider classics, were barely top 40 hits. That's how good that period was, and how ripe and rife with music it was. So going back to this then for a moment, if you're all these other artists and you're looking around, and all of the Beatles are having top 10 albums and top 5 hits that year, and they're putting out 2 top 5 albums in the red and the blue records, that's pretty overwhelming in terms of the amount of units they're selling. Because at a certain point, there are only so many consumer dollars for Tom to buy those 8 tracks with.
And those 2 albums, those set the pace for the year because those are the 2 first releases for that year. I mean, actually, it's early April. So here we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of those 2 releases. Those really set the pace. Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, would you consider that like the first, resurgence of the Beatles? I mean, here we go. There's nothing, I mean, it's still 3 years from the breakup.
Well, I wouldn't say the first few years of the 70s that there was very little interest in the Beatles because it was still fresh off the Beatles breakup. But definitely that did give it a boost. And I think 1973, those 2 releases were so important because here in the United States, with the exception of something like the Hey Jude album, which was a compilation, we didn't have any greatest hits albums in the Beatles. And for a lot of people who start out on greatest hits, that was their go-to, to start with the red and the blue albums. And they not only had hits on there, but they had album cuts on there, which you certainly had to do with the blue album because the singles were thinning out by then. But yeah, definitely, and then that led to all the compilations that came out in the 70s.
Is it true?
Music.
Is it true, Ken, that the red and the blue, is it true, Ken? That the red and the blue were really, we might not have had any of those compilations yet, except they were trying to stem the tide of a bootleg, yeah.
It's called
Alpha Omega.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's Greek to me.
But I think in many ways, 1973, it's a good point to bring up. The red and the blue albums, the success of the solo Beatles helped the sales of the red and the blue albums, and likewise it worked the other way. Before the red and the blue came out, My Love, it's becoming a #1 hit. Here's Rose Speedway. There's a lot of people, a lot of young fans discovering Paul McCartney and the other solo Beatles that don't know the history. And I know that's very hard for some people to believe. I like to bring this up a lot, as the radio person here. If you listen to Top 40 radio, their audience, their demographic audience is anything from little kids, usually to people in their 30s. There's a lot of little kids that grew up on Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, and Imagine, and had no idea who these guys were, And so they each got an audience of their own, as well as the Beatle fans from the past buying their stuff. And so you've got new audiences discovering the solo music, and then people are saying, hey, Paul was in this band before Wings. And then they're buying the red and the blue. But at the same time, if you discovered the Beatles stuff in 1973 and you're noticing, hey, these guys are also putting out solo stuff at the same time, you're investigating that. So it really worked both ways. It really benefited both sides, the group and the solo.
Joe, did you, when did you end up getting the red and blue album?
I actually got them later on, to tell you the truth. I mean, I think I was buying a lot of the American Capitol albums around that time, the early mid-'70s. And then I got the red and blue later on. And, what did I know? Later on, John Lennon's talking about how badly it was mixed. Some fool who tried to make it stereo, he said, and it didn't work, like the version of Revolution. Was turned into a piece of ice cream. I never noticed anything like that. It sounded good to me. But, the selection of songs on there, they're good helping. You can't have a greatest hits of the Beatles. I said that all the time. Even the one album, right? It's all the number ones, right? But there's so many beautiful songs. You gotta have the whole catalog. People ask me all the time when I do my channel, they say, what should I have if I want to get the Beatles' greatest hits? I tell them, get every album. But sometimes, I'll say, well, the one album you could start with, then the red and the blue, but you're damn well gonna get everything else because you're missing a ton of great songs that weren't so-called hits or the most popular tracks that people know that maybe weren't necessarily number one, but were on the red and the blue albums. But I think these days, I just think it's great that compilation of red and blue songs and the way they did the photos on the front and the back, the early Beatles, the late Beatles flipped around. That was ingenious. I love that. So yeah, but I got later on. I just got them as filler, like fill in the collection, fill in the holes. I actually didn't get it when it first came out. Either one.
Well, in our remaining time together, in our true Talk More Talk fashion, we want to throw this out to not only our panel, but to you guys. So 1973 obviously was a big year, but was it the only significant year in solo Beatles history? So this is what we want to throw out is, are there other years that you think were really significant in solo history? Now, it doesn't have to be where all four came out with releases on, because unfortunately there aren't that many choices. So it can be when
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Oh, come on. Oh, stickler for rules, that's our job. But it can be when, 3 came out with them, so I mean, we're kind of, come on, yeah. We're kind of broadening the rules here. So are there other, okay, so Tom you want to start out?
Yeah. I think 1970. It might not be as critically or commercially successful as 1973, but look, I mean, you got, again, 5 albums, like 1973, you had a big single in Instant Karma, 9-album single, like you had with, Live and Let Die. You had number 1 songs, you had, you had Let It Be and Long and Winding Road with Let It Be, and then you also had My Sweet Lord, and you capped it off with, arguably the best solo record with Plastic Ono Band, and you can also say that with All Things Must Pass. I mean, we got 2 top-notch, top-tier, top whatever you want to call it albums, closing out the year with All Things Must Pass and Plastic Ono Band. So I definitely would put 1970 as a close second to 1973.
And this goes out to Joe Mayo. One, because he's my favorite condiment. Also because I agree with him that we need all 4 to make this formula work. And my year is 1979 into 1980. And it's a sentimental choice because young me was just so excited that I fresh off Blow Away and Good Night Tonight and Back to the Egg, and of course there are rumors there's going to be a John Lennon album, oh my God. And then my brother and I got to go to the mall, the Greenspoint Mall, not that Greenspoint, the one in Houston, and we got to see Caveman with Ringo. I mean, we were living in just Beatles heaven, and it felt like it would never stop. And of course it does, but you know, we all have such an emotional and sentimentalized connection with the Beatles. For me, it was that year.
Well, Ken, you forgot a favorite of yours, Old Siam, Sir.
Yeah, he's right.
A
Exactly.
favorite of mine too, as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a lot of deep cuts, and on the Harrison album too, and certainly going into John Lennon, and we have McCartney too, and even Wonderful Christmas Time. Wherever you are, Lewiston, I'm sorry, I love it. Unabashedly.
Here,
Yeah.
I like the two.
That's my choice. Yours is good.
Okay, Ken, what's your nomination?
Well, there's a lot of great years, actually, but I will say there is something to be said about 1970 through 75, when John was still active, so you still had all four of them at the same time. But, I mean, 1970, definitely agree with you, Tom. So much great stuff. Just for All Things Must Pass alone.
Yeah.
What an amazing, you know, triple album set right there. And you know, I mean, most of us are not big fans of Apple Jam, but the other two albums, every song is fantastic right there. And to have Plastic Ono Band in there, the first McCartney album, 2 albums from Ringo, sensational, just in terms of output. But also 74 is great, 75 is great. The whole stretch of all the success of Wings, one album after another, going to #1. But I always like to point out 1976, because that was the Wings Over America tour. Still is, in my heart, the greatest concert I ever went to. Seeing Wings at Madison Square Garden in 1976. Wings at the Speed of Sound, #1 for 7 weeks. 2 major hits in there. The same year, Got to Get You Into My Life was a top 10 single, released as rock and roll music. They were in the top 10 at the same time. Paul McCartney and 2 different bands at the same time. You also have 33 1/3, which I think was a big bounce up from Extra Texture. Great album from George Harrison. You know, it's the start of a bit of a downward turn for Ringo with Ringo's Road Reviewer, but I like a lot of the songs on there. So for the 3 solo albums plus the Wings Over America tour, I definitely would consider 76 there. There's one other year that I'm going to mention, and that is, thanks to the guy with the flowers and the dirt shirt, 1989, because of Paul and Ringo touring.
Yeah.
The same year, the first year ever, Ringo toured with the All-Stars, and Paul's first tour since really 79, but in the United States since 76. Tremendous year. And Flowers and the Dirt is my favorite McCartney album, and I think it's, you know, an amazing collection of songs. So those are ones that I picked.
Okay. All right, Joe?
Well, you didn't leave me with much, Ken. I was going to say 77. No, not 70. No, well, look, for me, it's, yeah, you hate to say it, but the 70s, early 70s, 70 to 75, really, because I just like when all 4 Beatles are there, and, you know, they're putting out work, and they're, just having good music, and maybe touring, or some concerts around at the same time, and things like that. And for me, 71, you know, is fantastic year. Boy, you had everybody there. You had the concert for Bangladesh, Ringo and George there, right? And then you had, of course, I mentioned earlier about the Imagine album from John. It's fantastic. The Ram album, I still can't believe how in the world the critics savaged that back in the day.
Collusion.
And Ringo claimed that he didn't even think there was one good song on it. I think he said something like that effect, and now it's my favorite Paul album. You had all the Ringo with Don't Come Easy. It was still my favorite Ringo Starr track. I mean, even with the Beatles or without the Beatles, It Don't Come Easy is my favorite Ringo Starr song of 71, really. And I remember growing up as a kid, sitting on my stoop, being like 9 years old, listening to Uncle Albert. Perfect song for a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
You know, it just, to this day, reminds me of those wonderful times. And what it was like to be young and hear something that's child-friendly, but also kind of Beatle-y in a way. Uncle Albert is a favorite of mine. That was my pick when we did our show on the number ones of the solo. What do we think was number one? It was close. The Photograph was right there. And so, I couldn't pick, but yeah, 71, but all that whole period. A lot of times people say to me, when they talk about Beatles, oh, well, the early days and everything, those are the only ones that were good, but we won't get into that here. I agree with you, there's so much good stuff some people don't even tap into. But they say, oh, it's the early 70s, that was it, but they're not wrong that it's really a lot of the greatest stuff in that period, but it's not the only great stuff. Check out more.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Including up to present time, McCartney 3.
How about you guys? Any nominations? Yes.
How about 2021? You have Get Back, the film. You have, All Things Must Pass box set. You have the lyrics book. Wasn't that 2021? So what do you think was the best year in terms of like Beatles reissues? Because we're living in the age of the archive. It's a different game.
2018, I think. We got Wildlife from Rose Speedway. We got the Lennon box set then too. We got Egypt Station as well. I mean, the last 4 months of that year was madness with the Lennon box set, Egypt Station, the two McCartney box sets, and I think there was a George release in there too. Was that the
That wasn't the year of that
no,
Google box,
it
was it?
wasn't the crate year, was it?
$1,000.
Yeah, right.
I had to eat dog food for like a month.
But you had gnomes. I mean, dog food gnomes.
Anyone else?
As much as I love the archival box sets, I care more about the new releases,
Right.
so I tend to think in terms of those years. I might not remember the years of the archival box sets as they come out.
But I love those too.
I think it was the Ringo.
Definitely.
I think it was the Ringo release. Zoom in. Actually, I think that year too, or something. We got a Ringo release that year.
Okay, we have a couple others. Yeah.
Question here. It's more of an era thing than it is an actual year. I believe '94 was when the anthologies all came out. They came out like the end of '93 and then '94. I think the other two came out. So that was a huge year for Beatles. And then right on top of that was Flaming Fire.
Yeah.
So I mean that was huge.
Yep. Absolutely. Oh, fun time. I do remember that. Absolutely. Okay.
I have a question since the pros are up there.
Oh, stop.
In 71, I agree with Joe that I think Don't Come Easy is one of the best songs ever. And I know Ringo has the songwriting credit, but did George write that song?
Did you set him up?
I agree with you.
But did he write
Look,
that?
there's no doubt about it that George Harrison had a big part in Don't Come Easy. He's got his fingerprints all over the song, he produced it, he played guitar on it. The intro sounds exactly like what he did in Badge with Cream. But I also believe that you gotta go by what the Beatles have said. Because nobody knows their own songs other than the songwriters themselves. And Ringo did say on stage that George wrote a verse and a bridge. So the rest probably came from Ringo. So it's mainly, and also if you follow through the years, Ringo has said he's good at starting songs, he needs help finishing them. So basically, I can certainly hear him saying, got to pay your dues if you want to sing the blues. And that probably came from him, and he wrote a good, substantial part of it. But I do not believe that George wrote the entire song, which a lot of people are saying on YouTube, because they don't believe that Ringo is capable of writing anything that good. But I think that he co-wrote it.
Yes. I just thought maybe he was paying Ringo back for Maureen.
That's your territory.
Well, it hadn't happened yet.
Right.
But thank you.
Was he prepaying?
Oh boy. Well, on that note.
Back to the pub.
Back to the pub.
That's right. Well, we are celebrating our 5th year, believe it or not, on the air. Well, we couldn't do it without you, and to thank you, we have 5th year anniversary buttons, and these are brand new. So before you leave, come on up and take a button and to thank you for all of your support. We are recording this, so this episode will be up hopefully sometime next week. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special edition of